We've already seen that there's a tight link between perception and action. In this video, I'm going to drive home the notion that many cognitive functions are actually linked to our action system and shaped by our action system. And that idea is the notion of embodiment. The idea is that our cognition and our psychology does not just happen in isolation from the actions that we perform, but in fact that the fact that we have a body with certain capabilities and ability to translate our thoughts into actions, that body actually deeply impacts the way in which we think, the way in which we perceive the world, and a whole host of other psychological functions. So, embodiment is an interesting notion, especially when we go back to the start of this class, where we talked about this model of the brain that was more like a computer. And if we look at this model again for a second, the idea there was that, we have input devices like a keyboard and a mouse. They provide input to a memory system in some central processing unit. Sometimes it queries more long-term storage. A bunch of computation happens here. And then ultimately there's one one-directional arrow that goes towards the output. So that would be showing something on a computer screen or playing a sound or something like that. The idea of the mind then was input devices are sensory inputs, so vision, touch, taste, and so forth. They get put into our processing unit, meaning the brain, and then ultimately, after a whole bunch of stuff happens, then there's this afterthought that now this is translated into physical action. But physical action is kind of just a dumb thing that happens at the end, and as you see from the one-directional arrow, this action system has supposedly no impact on the other cognitive and psychological functions that happen up here. So that stands in really sharp contrast with the notion of embodiment, where we actually think that the shape and ways in which we use our body has fundamentally shaped, if not formed, the way in which we think. So embodiment is the notion that the way we think, perceive, and act is fundamentally shaped by the fact that we have a body. And if that's the case, then you would expect that at least cognitive functions would actually interact with the actions that we perform. Now, let me give you a first example of how that may work out. And this is a study where people had to make sensibility judgments about whether a certain short sentence that they were shown was actually a grammatically correct sentence or a grammatically incorrect sentence. So sometimes they would get gibberish sentences like the closed drawer, and then sometimes they would get grammatically correct sentences such as close the drawer. As they were verifying these sentences, rather than saying yes, it's correct or no, it's not correct, they varied whether they had to either push away from themselves to say something was correct or pull towards themselves to say that something was correct. And what they found is that when people verified, for example, the sentence close the drawer, they were faster to say yes if they had to make a pushing movement away from their body, which is very similar to the movement you would make if you were to close the drawer. They were slower if they had to say yes by pulling towards their body, which is not the way in which you close a drawer. On the other hand, if they had to say yes by pulling towards themselves, they were now faster at answering open the drawer to say yes, because now there was a match between the pulling motion and the opening of the drawer motion. And then in that case, they were actually slower if they had to say yes by pushing away from themselves. So what you see here is a very, very simple study that suggests that there's a link between processing this language and the action system. And if the action system happens to correspond with what the language is actually describing, then there's a match and people are faster at performing these actions than if there is a mismatch. So that suggests that embodiment is actually at play. The way in which we use our body here now influences how quickly we can verify whether a sentence is grammatically correct or not. In another set of studies, Dennis Profit and at the time his graduate student Jessica Witt, who is a friend of mine and has done a lot of work on her own after she left Denny's lab, but in one of their original studies, they looked at the slant of a hill and how steep a person perceived the hill to be. And the way in which they did this was that they would put them on the bottom of a hill, and they had a little hand pad that they would rest their hand on, and their task was then to change the tilt of that hand pad so that the tilt would match the steepness of the hill that they perceived. So people were reasonably good at this, but then the key manipulation was the following. In one group of people, they just did this judgment task and they just looked at what the angle was that they provided. In the other group of people, they told them, hey, we're going to do this judgment task, and then after that, you're going to have to climb up that hill. And lo and behold, just by them knowing that they now had to climb the hill later, they actually provided steeper gradings of that hill. They saw the hill as being steeper if they knew that they had to climb it later than if they knew that they didn't. They've done a lot of follow-up studies on that, and they've shown that, if you're wearing a backpack, the hill is even perceived as even steeper. If you had a bottle of Coke with a lot of sugar in it, people perceive it as less steep, and so forth. So that's very interesting because it suggests again that the makeup of our bodies, as well as the anticipation of using our bodies later, influence the way in which we perceive the world. Jesse did a follow-up study that is in a similar spirit, except much more dramatic. And what she did in that study was that she gave participants these ambiguous frames where sometimes a gun was present, sometimes no gun was present. And participants' task was just to say as quickly as they could whether there was a gun in the scene or not. Again, she created 2 experimental groups. In one group, they just did this judgment task. And in the other group, she actually handed them a gun to hold so that they had a gun in their hand while they did the task of identifying a gun. And lo and behold, and in some ways scarily enough, she found that when people were holding a gun, they were more likely to detect a gun than if they were not holding a gun, and sometimes erroneously so. So again, giving people certain tools that change their action capabilities on the world actually changed their perception. So holding a gun made it more likely for them to see a gun, and sometimes, again, incorrectly so. Of course, that has implications for people having guns and training of police officers and so forth. This is purely a basic study that finds that changing people's action capabilities influences the way in which they see the world. So these studies too speak to the notion of embodiment in that sense. Now, one other way in which we use our body to try to actually understand the world and to learn is by imitation. And you specifically see this, of course, a lot in little children. So the link between perception and action provides a possible mechanism through which children may learn through imitation. If they can map other people's actions onto their own motor system, and then they can perform the same actions themselves, they can kind of figure out, okay, if I imitate this, here's what happens. So there's a distinction between 2 terms here, imitation and mimicry. Imitation is the ability to understand the intent of an observed agent and then reproduce it. So that's very intentional. Mimicry is an unintentional way of copying other people's behaviors and postures and mannerisms. And mimicry, there's actually a large literature in social psychology to show that, for example, if I were standing in front of a lecture room right now and I would start putting my hand on my face a bunch, the odds are that some of you in the minute or 2 following would be more likely to actually put your own hand on your face as well. Or if I would start standing there with my arms crossed, more and more of you would actually end up sitting with your arms crossed as well. So that is mimicry. And they have, for example, done some interesting studies on mimicry where they looked at waiters and waitresses and their likelihood of getting a tip and the size of that tip. And in one group, they just told people just serve and see what kind of tip you get. And in the other group, they were trained, the researchers, to actually engage in some mimicry. So in that group, the waiter or waitress actually very, very subtly imitated the person that they mimicred the person that they were serving. And what they found was that indeed, when they did so, it increased the size of their tip, except, of course, one caveat. If the person became aware and started realizing that they were being imitated, then actually it backfired entirely. But these subtle imitations, that mimicry between a client and the waiter, actually, if it was unintentional and it stayed at the level of mimicry rather than imitation, it actually led to people increasing the size of their tips. How does imitation develop? Well, it turns out that newborns right out of the gates have an ability to imitate, and they've shown this with facial expressions mostly. So when a parent sticks out their tongue, a baby sticks out their tongue. When they open their mouth, baby opens their mouth, and so forth. And it turns out that this imitation is right there right away, facial imitation, and then object-directed imitation starts around 6 months of age. So this is where, when you're sitting at a table, when you're using your silverware to eat, a baby may start picking up their silverware and trying to imitate you in that object-directed kind of way. Now, there's been some claims that imitation is actually intentional and that children are fairly rational in what they imitate and what they don't imitate. And this is a domain where there is still substantial debate, but I just wanted to tell you about the study that gave rise to that debate. If you look at the things that kids do and what they imitate, it is interesting because people will put, for example, a doll to bed, children, rather than putting a car to bed, although that's not impossible, but mostly children engage in some sort of imitation that's actually making sense given that the objects that they're dealing with. And there's been a claim, as I said, that imitation may in fact be rational for 14 months of age young children. And the way in which they looked at this and based on which they claimed this was the following study. They put a magical box on the table, and that box had a light in it, and if you touched the light would turn on. They then had these 14-month-olds watch an experimenter do this in two different situations. In one situation, this experimenter was wrapped in a blanket so that their hands were not available to touch the button, and they watched them touch the button with their head and turn the light on with their head. In the other condition, the hands were available, but still the experimenter showed touching the light with their head and turning the light on with their head. Interestingly enough, after this, when the 14-month-olds were given this box, and they watched either this movie with hands not available, hands occupied versus hands free. In the hands occupied condition, most of the 14-month-olds actually used their hands to turn on the button because supposedly they figured, well, this person would have done this with their hands, but their hands weren't available. So the only reason they used their head was because they didn't have their hands available. I have my hands available, so therefore I will just do it with my hands. On the other hand, when they watched this movie, when the hands were free, they were more likely to turn the light on with their head. And supposedly their thinking was, okay, her hands are available, she's not using them, so therefore it must make more sense to do this with my head. I'm going to do this with my head as well. So based on this data, these data published in Nature, there's been a debate about whether imitation is rational. Based on this study, the researchers originally claimed that it was.